I hope you'll be here next Sunday, of course. One of the things next week we will talk about God's call, or one of God's call. The Bible is full of them, but God's call for us to be grateful people. A call to thanksgiving. And since we're coming up on the Thanksgiving holiday, it seems like a good time to talk about that. After we get done with that, the following Sunday, we'll begin a new series, and we'll go back to the New Testament. We've been in the Old Testament for a while, but you've heard the phrase, the way things ought to be. Well, the book of Ephesians, I think if you were going to give a subtitle to the book of Ephesians, I think maybe the way things ought to be might be a good one, because really what you've got in Ephesians, as I see it, you've got two things. The first half of the book, you've got Paul making it clear all the incredible things that God has done for us as His people, the church. And in response, the last half of the book, more or less, you have Paul saying, in light of what God has done for us, here's what we ought to do in response, and here's who we ought to be in response. And so it's a good roadmap for us to check ourselves, a good, you might say, measuring stick for us to measure ourselves against. It's Ephesians is you might say it's a depiction of the church in its ideal, and I think I'm still relatively new here, assuming we last for more than 6 months, but I think it's a good place for us to begin and try to see who we ought to be and get on the same page. Losing a spouse, the death of a spouse, is never an easy thing. When I was in Littlefield, Texas, a woman named Clendell, she was on her deathbed, and her husband, Weldon, came up to me and he said, I think we were at the hospital and outside of a room, and he looked at me and he had a terrible expression on his face, and he said, I've been married to her 60 years and I'm not ready to give her up yet. And of course he wasn't. The longer you're with a person, the harder it is to say goodbye. And it was a tough thing for him. He would go out and sit pretty much every day at her grave and talk to her, and he didn't stay around long after she left this world. But if that was tough, just imagine Abraham when his wife Sarah died. Abraham and Sarah, for reasons that I'll point out here in a moment, Abraham and Sarah had likely been married to one another for more than a century when Sarah died. In Genesis, and you have to think, when she died, part of Abraham must have died with her. If you got your handout with you, we're filling in the notes, and I have to keep remembering that we're doing this, but the first blank there under Roman numeral 1, Abraham and Sarah had likely been married for more than a century when Sarah died. Those are the words to fill in, when Sarah died. Genesis 23, verse 2, that scripture should be in your bulletin there. Genesis 23, verses 1 and 2, we find out that Sarah was 127 years old when she passed away. And if you assume 27, there were no funeral directors in those days, I'm sure, as we understand them now, and so to a large part, to a great extent, we can imagine that funeral arrangements were. I'm sure he was crippled with grief at that point. Roman numeral 2 then, Abraham is going about taking care of these funeral arrangements, and we find that Abraham bought a burial place for Sarah in the land of Canaan. The word to fill in there is burial. Abraham bought a burial place for Sarah in the land of Canaan. And Genesis chapter 23, verse 3, we read about that event. Genesis 23, verse 3, Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And what we find out, there is a seller. There's someone willing to sell a burial plot to Abraham, and it's Ephron the Hittite. In Genesis 23, verse 17, The field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout the whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, before all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave in the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. Now, we know that the whole Bible is inspired and it's all relevant, it's all important, but this passage may seem like maybe a more mundane area of Scripture to you. But I really think it's one of those places where, as we talked about in the Bible class this morning, where if you do a little bit of diligence and you dig, you find there's something worth looking for. And I believe that's the case here. And here's what I would say for Roman numeral 3 in your outline. We're burning through the outline today. I would say this, that Abraham's selection of a burial place seems unusual to me for several reasons. And it may not seem unusual to you as of yet, but I think as we go along, if you bear with me and you listen, maybe you'll find that it is an unusual selection. And here's letter A under Roman numeral. I can't get that right. Roman numeral 3, we read this. First of all, Abraham may have paid too much for this burial place. The words to fill in there would be too much. You may have paid too much for this burial place. As a matter of fact, if you go back to Genesis chapter 23, verse 15, verse that we haven't read yet, we find that Ephron the Hittite is going to sell this field to Abraham for 400 shekels of silver, a shekel being a certain weight of silver. Exactly what the weight is, I don't know, but that's what we find, and that may sound perfectly normal to you, but it's important to do a little bit of comparison. If you jump forward to Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, chapter 32, verse 9, that price gets put in perspective a little bit, because in Jeremiah 32, verse 9, Jeremiah says that he bought a field for 17 shekels of silver. Now, if I buy something for $400 and then Charles Porter goes and buys the same thing for $17, you know what? I might, when he says, I paid $17 for it, I paid $400. I might feel like I kind of got taken to the cleaners. I might feel like I didn't get a very good deal. Now, you may say, well, Paul, you can't really compare these two fields. Maybe one field was bigger than the other, or maybe one had more valuable land, or maybe prices were different at different periods in history. I'll give you that. Those are certainly possibilities. But it's also important to consider that Abraham, he's way over here in Canaan where he's a foreigner. It's also important to consider that if he had wanted to, he could have taken his wife back home to the land of Ur the Chaldeans, and he could have buried her there for free in his family burial plot, which I'm sure he would have had one. He was well established there. There should have been a burial place where he could have gone. And you might say, you might take issue with me again, and you might say, well, Paul, he's right there in Canaan. Why would he travel hundreds of miles back to Ur the Chaldeans just to bury his wife? You might say that, but here's something else I would throw back at you. It was important to the people of this time, and Scripture bears it out, it was important to the people of this time to be buried at home with their family, even if a journey of hundreds of miles was necessitated for that burial. And we have a couple of examples here. First of all, Jacob. Jacob, of course, being Abraham's grandson, you know, Jacob would have a son Isaac, and Isaac would have two sons, Jacob and Esau. Well, Jacob, he had 12 sons, and when Jacob was about to die, in Genesis 49, verse 29, you know what he said to his sons? He said, you are to bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. That's what he said, and that was going to require Jacob's sons to carry his body hundreds of miles from Egypt back to the land of Canaan. But it was so important to him to be buried with his family that they made it happen. And that's not the only instance. Jacob's son Joseph would require the same thing. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 25, when Joseph was about to die, he required his family to make the same assurance to him. And he said, you shall carry my bones up from here. They were to, when they left Egypt, they were to carry his bones back to the land of his fathers. And so it was important at that time to be buried at home with family. And yet Abraham's not doing that. So I suggest to you that's a bit puzzling. And I think this actually has relevance if you'll bear with me. Here's another thing to consider. Abraham comes from a pagan culture. Ur of the Chaldeans back in the land of Mesopotamia, not Babylon yet, as I said last week, but Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of Mesopotamia, that's a pagan culture. His fathers would have worshipped pagan gods, and the religious beliefs of that culture were that if you died outside of the land of your fathers and were buried outside of the land of your fathers, they would have believed that that meant forfeiting the afterlife. It was a big deal. So there were some compelling reasons here for Abraham to have carried his wife Sarah back to Ur of the Chaldeans to bury her there with her family. So that's my question. We're moving on here to Roman numeral 4 in your outline, and here's the question that I pose to you: Why didn't Abraham bury Sarah at home in the land of in the land of Ur? Why didn't he bury Sarah in her homeland? And I think if you could get in a time machine and jump back 4,000 years, and if you could ask Abraham that question, here's what I think he would say. If you said, why aren't you taking Sarah to bury her in her homeland? You know what I think he'd say? I think he'd tell you, I am burying her in my homeland, right here in Canaan. Here's what I think Abraham's doing. I think Abraham is making a very deliberate statement. I think he knows exactly what he's doing. And here's the blanks to fill in. I believe Abraham is showing his belief in God's promise. The words to fill in are God's promise. Abraham is showing his belief in God's promise to give Canaan to his descendants, to his offspring, to his children. Now that's an event Abraham won't see. That won't happen for centuries until finally, under Joshua, the Israelites begin to take the land of Canaan. Nevertheless, right now, Abraham is claiming the land of Canaan as his homeland. His actions, I think, are speaking very loudly right now, and I think here's what his actions are saying. His actions are saying, God, Jehovah God, I believe you, and God, I trust you to keep your promises. Now, you can't keep from communicating. No matter what you do, you can't keep from communicating. I'm communicating right now. I may not be communicating what I want to, but one way or the other, I'm going to get up here and I'm going to communicate. And if you're doing this right now, you're communicating. You may not intend to, but you are. If you're nodding your heads and taking notes, you're filling in the outline that kind of says you're with me. Maybe you're faking it, but I think you mean it. All right? We can't keep from communicating one way or the other, and you can fake it for a while, right? But eventually, what you do will reveal what is in your heart. And that's what Jesus said about false teachers. In Matthew 7, verse 15, here's what Jesus said. He said, you'll be able to pick out the false teachers. Just keep watching them. Matthew 7, verse 15, Jesus said, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits, right? Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Hang around somebody for a while. Sooner or later, you'll know who they are. The truth comes out one way or another. And so my question there is this: what are we proclaiming? What are our actions pronouncing about what we believe? What fruit are we bearing? What message are we sending out? Because I guarantee you, right now in this building, you are sending out a message, and when you walk out of here today and you go to the restaurant to eat your lunch, you're going to be sending out a message to those waitresses, good or bad. I remember when we lived in Littlefield, we heard about a local restaurant that had closed down on Sundays, and it was because they couldn't get waitresses to work, because unfortunately, when the members of the churches around in that area would come in on Sunday, they were rude and they didn't tip very well, and the waitresses thought, I didn't want anything of it. What kind of a message is that? We go out and we proclaim what we believe no matter what we do. What about Abraham? Abraham sent out a message, not so much through what he did or what he said, but through what he did. And the cool thing about Abraham, the message he proclaimed through his actions, we're still getting that message 4,000 years down the line. It's still coming through loud and clear. Really, here's what it is. Here's Abraham's message. Here's what I hope you've been getting out of the last few weeks. If Abraham's God is not real, and if Abraham's God isn't a God who keeps his promises, then Abraham's life is nonsense. Abraham's life really makes no sense. His actions are foolish. You think about it, if Abraham's God isn't real, what should Abraham have done? He never should have packed up his U-Haul and pulled out of Ur. He should have stayed home. He was doing just fine there. He was well established. He had a good reputation. He was probably old money there. He was prosperous. It would have been silly for Abraham to believe if his God wasn't real and if his promises would not be kept. Abraham's actions, his life, only makes sense if his God is real and if he will keep his promises. And so that's my call to you this morning. Let's be like Abraham in that respect. You know, you can go out and a big majority of people in this country will report if you walk up to them on the street with a microphone, you say, "Are you a Christian?" Yeah, they'll report it. You know, they might be walking out of a bar half drunk. Yeah, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer. They might be doing all kinds of bad things, but they'll say, "Oh yeah, I'm a believer." All right. Well, it's good to state that belief, but it's good to back it up with what you do too. And that's why I'm saying let's be like Abraham. Let's live lives. Let's take actions. Let's make decisions. And here's Roman numeral 5, that proclaim our trust in God. What I do every day. You know, you get around some people sometimes, and the way you deal with them in your businesses, in the businesses that you go to. There have been a few times where I've walked out of a business, and I'll say to Crystal, she'll say to me, "You know, I bet that person was a Christian." Because they dealt with us very well, they were kind, they went above and beyond, they did things they didn't have to do, and they just made us feel great. And you walk out of there and you think, I bet that person was a Christian. And that's, I think, being the kind of person that Abraham was. We need to live lives that only make sense if God's promises are true. And if we are, you know, you hear a lot of disturbing things this week about rioting in the streets and just all kinds of death threats and all kinds of terrible things that are going on where people are just being ugly. But that's not who we are. We don't take any part in that. That may be going on around us, but we're different. We're oddballs. We're unique. We are distinct, and we're not ashamed to be oddballs. No matter what the world has going on around us, we don't partake of it. We are different. But the Bible word for being that kind of an oddball, for being kind of a head scratcher like Abraham was, the Bible word for that is not weird, right? The Bible word for being that kind of different, what is it? It's holy, set apart, sanctified, different like God is different, holy as God is holy. And here's the cool thing about it. If you can do that, if you can stick to your guns and you be like Jesus no matter what the world around you is being like, Jesus has some encouraging words for you. He says people who live like that in Matthew 5 verse 14, he says those kind of people are what? Are the lights of the world. And that's who we need to be when we walk out of here. And you know, I got to admit, you guys are doing a great job of that. I invited some, and it's a little out of my comfort zone, I invited some strangers to church last night. And the reason why is I thought, you know, no matter what issues these people have, I don't believe they're going to come into this congregation and be judged harshly. I believe they're going to be loved and accepted. And that empowered me and encouraged me to want to invite those people. I believe you guys are doing we can always be better, but I believe right now you guys are being the lights that Jesus wants you to be. And so I'm not trying to be condemning. We're proud to be here. But it's also true, Jesus says, you follow me in this world, you will have trouble. And that's why, again, here's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 19. Paul says, if we're not going to receive our promised homeland, Paul says if there is no resurrection of the dead, you know what? We, above all people, if there's no resurrection of the dead, are to be pitied, right? Our lives really, when you get down to it, our lives don't make any sense unless God is up there in heaven and everything He said is going to come to pass. Consider the apostles. They were doing just fine. I'm sure Peter was quite good at fishing. I'm sure that the rest of the apostles, they weren't sitting in an unemployment line. They had well-established lives. They had good jobs. They had pretty good lives, as good as anybody's, I'm sure. And yet, when they left those lives behind to follow Jesus, consider Paul's description of them in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 13. Paul said, speaking for himself and speaking of the other apostles, this is not an example of career advancement in human terms. 1 Corinthians 4:13, Paul says, "We have become and still are like the cream of the crop, the top of society." That's not what he said. He said, "We have become and still are like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things." Why in the world would these guys go on to be beaten and persecuted and virtually to the last man? Why would they die martyrs' deaths unless the Lord they served, unless the Lord they proclaimed was really the Son of God, and unless His promises were true? Their lives would be foolish if God's promises aren't true. So, right now, I think there are places in the world where there's terrible persecution going on against Christians. Right now, we're pretty free of persecution. We have some people who are hostile to our faith, but nothing compared to what you could find going to a lot of places around the globe. Nevertheless, no matter what happens, we need to be more than fair weather friends of God. Let's be like Abraham no matter what. Our lives, our actions, our decisions, in everything we do, need to proclaim our certainty, the same certainty that Abraham proclaimed when he bought that field in Canaan, when he bought that cave to bury his wife in, when it didn't really make any sense from human terms. What was he proclaiming? He was saying, God is going to give me this place as a promised land. And we likewise need to proclaim the same certainty that God will give us a promised land that we will never see in this life. And Paul, again, granted, Jesus is our ultimate example. And Jesus is our ultimate, we strive to imitate Him in every way that we can. Nevertheless, Abraham is another good example. His faith that leads him to obey, even when from a worldly perspective his obedience is preposterous. That's the kind of faith that Paul, the Apostle Paul, calls us to. Galatians 3, verse 6, Galatians 3:6, Paul said this about Abraham. He said, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as what? As righteousness. And then he goes on and he talks about us in verse 7, and he says, know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. There are those who can trace their biological lineage back to Abraham, maybe, who are Jews by physical descent, but the true people of God, true Israel, aren't those with Abraham's biological connection. They are those with Abraham's faith connections. So if we have the faith of Abraham that leads us to obey no matter what, we are spiritual Israel. Let's be like Abraham. Let's believe God and let's obey God no matter what. Let's be set apart from the world. It's in this part of the world, I think it's great that we're free of persecution, but sometimes we go to church because it's kind of the thing to do. In a lot of places in the Bible Belt, it's good that there's positive peer pressure to be in church on Sunday morning. And I think that you see that more so in this part of the world than other places, and I think that's good. But you go out to the East Coast and the West Coast and a lot of places outside of the Bible Belt, and people are going to church even though they're going to be made fun of. Even though, as I was told out in Marin County, you tell people you go to church, a lot of them will write you off. So what? If it comes to that, we need to keep following God anyway. Let's be more than fair weather friends of God. Let's be set apart from the world. Let's be people of faith. And it doesn't matter what the world thinks of us. Let's care about what God thinks of us. Let's do what it takes to be counted as righteous by God. This morning, if you need to make things right, if you need to walk in the footsteps of Abraham, if you need to begin a walk in the footsteps of Jesus, walking in the light as He is in the light, there's no better time than today than to begin that walk. If you've wandered away and you need to come home, whatever your needs may be, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing this invitation song.